In 1878, a cowboy walked into his stable before dawn and found a stranger standing next to the most dangerous horse he'd ever owned. A horse that had put two men in the hospital. A horse that no one could touch. But this woman, she was brushing him like he was a kitten. And the horse, eyes half closed, breathing slow, completely at peace. She had no name he could trust. No past she was willing to share, and someone out there was hunting her. He should have sent her away. He should have called the sheriff. Instead, he handed her a key. That decision would cost him everything he believed about himself, and give him everything he never thought he deserved. This is the story of Owen, Lydia, and a horse named Thunder who trusted no one, until the right person showed up. The lesson. Sometimes the people who seem the most broken are the ones who teach us how to heal. What this story means. This is a story about second chances, about the lies we tell to survive and the truths we must tell to truly live. About a woman brave enough to stop running, and a man brave enough to let someone in. It reminds us that trust isn't given once. It's built day after day by people willing to try again even after being hurt. If this story made you feel something, you're not alone. Drop a comment and tell me. Which moment hit you the hardest? And if you know someone who needs to hear this today, share it with them. Subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a story that stays with you long after it ends. Now, before I tell you this story, I need you to understand something about the kind of man Owen Quillen was in the summer of 1878. He was the kind of man who checked the locks twice, the kind who rode his fence lines before dawn and after dark, the kind who slept with one ear open and a Colt revolver within arm's reach, because he had learned the hard way that the world does not send warnings before it takes what you love. He was 33 years old that August, owned a ranch on the eastern outskirts of San Bernardino, California. 200 head of cattle, 9 horses, 6 men who worked for him. A house his father built with his own 2 hands before his heart gave out mending a fence post 6 years prior. Owen had taken that ranch and turned it into something real, something that mattered, not because he was chasing wealth or reputation, but because work was the only thing that kept the nightmares quiet, and the nightmares were bad. They came almost every night, always the same. A voice calling his name from somewhere in the dark. The smell of dry grass and summer heat. A sound like a rattle shaking inside a tin can. And then silence. The kind of silence that comes after something terrible has happened, and the world holds its breath because it knows there is nothing left to say. Owen never told anyone about the dreams. He just got up, pulled on his boots, walked the ranch, checked the stable, counted the horses, made sure everything was where it was supposed to be. Control. That was what kept Owen Quillen sane. As long as he controlled everything, nothing could go wrong. Nothing could slip past him in the dark. That particular morning in August, he woke at 4. The nightmare had been worse than usual. He could still feel the weight of something in his arms. Something small and still and warm that was getting colder by the second. He shook it off the way a horse shakes off flies and pulled on his boots and walked toward the stable. The first thing he noticed was the silence. Not the silence of an empty stable. Owen knew that sound well enough. This was different. This was the silence of Thunder's stall. And Thunder was never silent. Thunder was a 5-year-old stallion, black as a moonless night, mean as a stepped-on rattlesnake. Owen had bought him at a livestock auction 2 years back because something in the horse's eyes reminded him of himself. Wild and angry and broken in ways that did not show on the surface. He had tried to break Thunder the traditional way, rope and muscle and will. Thunder had kicked him so hard the bone in Owen's forearm cracked and left a scar that ran from his wrist to his elbow. After that, Owen tried gentler methods. None of them worked either. Thunder had put 2 ranch hands in the doctor's office, tried to bite the face off a horse trainer from Los Angeles. 3 different men told Owen to sell the animal or shoot him. Owen kept him anyway. He did not know why. Maybe because giving up on Thunder felt too much like giving up on himself. But Thunder was never quiet. He paced. He snorted. He kicked the walls of his stall at all hours. The sound of thunder being thunder was as much a part of the ranch as the wind through the valley grass. And right now, that sound was gone. Owen's hand went to the revolver at his hip. He drew it without thinking. His fingers found the grip, and his thumb found the hammer, and he stepped into the stable doorway with the barrel raised and his heart beating hard against his ribs. Then he saw her. A woman stood inside Thunder's stall, right next to the horse, close enough to touch him, close enough for Thunder to kill her with one kick if he wanted to. She held a brush in her right hand, and she was running it down Thunder's neck in long, slow strokes. The horse stood still as stone. His eyes were half closed. His breathing was slow and even. Owen had never seen Thunder like that, not once in 2 years. The woman was tall and lean, dressed in a cotton dress that had seen better days and then some. Her hair was dark blonde, pulled back in a braid that fell between her shoulder blades. Her hands moved with a kind of confidence that Owen recognized. It was not the confidence of someone who thought they knew what they were doing. It was the confidence of someone who actually did. She was humming. Something low and quiet. A melody Owen had never heard before. Thunder's ears were pointed forward, listening to every note like it was the most important sound in the world. Owen should have called out, should have demanded to know who she was and what she was doing in his stable before sunup. Instead, he stood there with his gun raised and watched. Because something about this scene made no sense. And Owen Quillen was not the kind of man who pulled the trigger before he understood what he was looking at. She must have felt him watching because she turned. And Owen found himself staring into the palest green eyes he had ever seen. The color of new sage after a spring rain. Her eyes flicked to the stable's back door before they settled on his face, quick, automatic, the way a hunted animal checks its exits. Owen filed that detail away. She did not flinch at the gun, did not gasp or cry out or drop the brush. She just looked at him, steady, measuring. The way you look at something that might be dangerous but might also be the answer to a prayer you have not said yet. Owen lowered the revolver, not because he trusted her, because Thunder trusted her, and that horse did not trust anyone. "My stable is not an inn," Owen said. His voice came out rough, gritty from sleep and surprise. "I know," the woman said. Her voice was steady, soft but not weak. "I was passing through. I heard him calling." "Calling," Owen repeated. "Calling," she said again. She turned back to Thunder and ran her hand down his nose. The horse leaned into her touch. He was not calling for just anyone. He was calling because he was lonely, angry, yes, but mostly lonely. Owen stared at her. Then he stared at Thunder. The horse who had tried to kill everyone who came near him for 2 years was standing there with his nose pressed against this stranger's shoulder like she was the only good thing left in the world. "Who are you?" Owen said. It was not a question. It was a demand. She hesitated. He could see her weighing something behind those green eyes, calculating, deciding how much truth to hand a stranger with a gun. "Lydia," she said. "Lydia Voss." That was the first lie she told him. It would not be the last. Owen holstered the Colt. "Owen Quillen, and you are standing next to a horse that put 2 men in the hospital this year alone. So either you have got a death wish or you have got a gift I cannot explain." "My father raised horses," she said simply. "He taught me their language." Owen looked at Thunder, looked at the woman, looked at the darkness outside where the sky was just barely starting to lighten along the ridge of the San Bernardino Mountains. "My stable is not an inn," he said again, "but there is a storage shed behind the main house. You can sleep there tonight. We will talk in the morning." She nodded. "Set the brush down on the edge of the stall." Thunder tossed his head the moment she stepped away from him, stamped his hoof, let out a sound that was halfway between a whinny and a protest. Owen watched the woman walk past him toward the shed. She moved like someone who is used to making herself small. Shoulders slightly hunched, steps quiet, eyes checking everything. The corners, the shadows, the distance between her and the nearest door. He locked the shed behind her but left the window unlatched. If she wanted to run in the night, she could. He wanted to see if she would. He went back to the main house and sat on the edge of his bed and stared at the wall and tried to make sense of what he had just witnessed. A stranger, in his stable, with the most dangerous horse he had ever owned. And the horse had been standing there like a lamb. Owen realized something that bothered him more than the trespassing, or the lying, or the mystery of how she had gotten past his fence line without making a sound. He was hoping she would still be there in the morning. That scared him worse than the revolver. Lydia did not sleep. She sat in the dark shed with her back against the wall and her fingers wrapped around the small knife hidden inside her right boot. It was a plain thing, wooden handle, 3-inch blade. Nothing special to look at. But it was the only thing she had kept from that night 3 months ago, and she was not letting go of it now. She counted her heartbeats the way her father had taught her to count a horse's breathing. Steady rhythm, in and out. 72, 73, 74. Below 100 meant safe enough to stay. Above 100 meant run. Her heart stayed in the 70s. Barely. She thought about the man, Owen Quillen, the way he had drawn on her without hesitation, the way his hand had trembled on the grip, not from weakness. She knew what weakness looked like in a man's hands, and that was not it. That was something else, something old and deep, a wound that had not healed right. She thought about the way he had lowered the gun, not because she had begged or cried or given him any reason to trust her, because of the horse. He had looked at Thunder standing calm beside her, and something in his face had shifted, like watching a locked door swing open that he had given up trying to force. Then her mind went where it always went when the dark got quiet enough. Back to Kansas. Back to the house with the root cellar in the kitchen with the knife block and the rifle on the wall. Back to Robert. The memory came in pieces the way it always did. She did not fight it. Fighting made it worse. Darkness. The sound of glass breaking downstairs. The reek of whiskey so strong it burned her eyes from across the room. Robert's boots on the stairs, heavy, deliberate. The way a man walks when he has made a decision, and the decision is violence. His hand on her throat, not squeezing yet, just holding, letting her feel how easy it would be. The kitchen knife in his other hand, the one with the wooden handle, the one she had used that morning to slice bread for his breakfast. His voice, quiet, almost gentle. That was the worst part, the gentleness. I am going to teach you a lesson you will carry for the rest of your life. Her hand finding the rifle on the wall. The rifle Robert had hung there himself. The blast, the silence after. And then running. Out the door, down the road, into the dark. Not stopping to check if he was breathing. Not stopping for anything. Just running until her legs gave out and then getting up and running some more. That was 3 months ago. She had crossed 5 states since then. Taken work where she could find it, washed dishes, mucked stalls, slept in barns and under bridges, and once in a church that left its doors unlocked at night. She had changed her name twice. Voss was the second name. The first had been Carter, but she had dropped it in Colorado when a man at a general store looked at her too long. She had $2 when she reached San Bernardino. Then she had none. Then she heard the horse. It was not a sound most people would have noticed. A low, troubled sound. Not quite a whinny. More like a question asked by something that had stopped expecting an answer. Lydia heard it from the road, and her feet turned toward it before her brain could object, because her father had taught her one thing above all others. When a horse calls you, answer. That is the deal between them and us. She found the stable. Found Thunder. And for the first time in 3 months she felt something other than fear. Morning light crept through the shed's one window. Lydia heard footsteps on the dirt outside. She slipped the knife back into her boot and stood up and brushed the straw from her dress and tried to look like someone who had slept instead of someone who had spent the night cataloging escape routes. Owen came with coffee and flapjacks wrapped in a cloth. He was not carrying a gun. She noticed that immediately. He had made a choice to come to her unarmed, and that choice told her more about him than any words could have. He set the food on an overturned crate and leaned against the doorframe and looked at her with those dark, steady eyes. "I am not asking where you came from," he said. "I am not asking why. I am asking what you can do." "I can do anything that involves horses," Lydia said, "and I do not cause trouble." The irony of that second part almost made her laugh. Almost. Owen took her to the stable. The other hands were not up yet. Just the two of them, and the horses, and the early morning light coming through the gaps in the wooden boards. "Saddle him," Owen said, nodding toward Thunder's stall. "Get him calm enough to take a saddle and keep it there for 5 minutes. Do that, and we will talk about a job." Lydia looked at the horse. Thunder looked back at her. His ears went forward. His nostrils flared. She could read him the way other people read books. He was tense, wary. But underneath the wariness was something else. Hope, maybe, or the memory of hope. She entered the stall sideways, did not look at Thunder directly, stood with her body angled away from him, breathed slow and deep the way her father had taught her, the way the Comanche horseman had taught her father decades ago on the plains of Kansas when he was young enough to listen without judgment. The trick was simple and impossible at the same time. You did not go to the horse. You let the horse come to you. You made yourself small and quiet and patient, and you waited. Most people could not wait. They got nervous or bored or scared, and they reached out too soon. And the horse read that reaching as a threat. Lydia could wait. She had learned patience in a root cellar. 4 days in the dark will teach you things about waiting that no horse trainer ever could. 40 minutes passed. Owen stood outside the fence without moving. An older man with a scar on his cheek stood beside him. Lydia did not know his name yet. He was watching her with suspicion plain on his face. Thunder took one step toward her, then another. Then he was close enough that she could feel his breath on her shoulder. She stayed still. He snorted, pushed his nose against her arm. She turned slowly and pressed her forehead against his and closed her eyes and breathed with him. Behind her, she heard Owen let out a breath he had been holding for 40 minutes. She saddled Thunder in the next 10 minutes. The horse stood still as a church pew, did not flinch, did not kick, did not try to bite, just stood there with his ears forward and his eyes soft and let her work. The older man spoke first. His voice was sharp with disbelief. "Boss, you cannot be serious. Hiring a drifter with no papers and no references based on one trick with a horse." "That was not a trick, Charlie," Owen said quietly. He was still staring at Thunder. "I do not know what that was, but it was not a trick." "And if she steals a horse in the night," Charlie pressed, "what then?" Owen looked at Lydia. She looked back. Neither of them blinked. 2-week trial, Owen said. "Wages held until the trial ends. There is a cabin past the bunkhouse, small but clean. Lock on the door. You work with the horses. You take meals with us or in your cabin. Your choice. Every man on this ranch treats you with respect or answers to me. That is the deal." Lydia weighed it. She weighed the risk of staying in one place against the risk of moving on with nothing. She weighed the look in Owen's eyes against every other look she had received from men in the past 3 months. Hunger, pity, contempt. Owen's look was none of those things. His look said, "I do not understand you yet, but I am willing to try." "I can do the work," she said. "I know you can," Owen said. "I just watched you." He handed her a key, a simple iron key on a plain ring. "Cabin is yours. That key is the only copy." Lydia took it. Her fingers closed around the cold metal, and she felt something loosen in her chest. Something she had been holding so tight for so long she had forgotten it was there. She walked to the cabin. It was small. One room, a bed with a straw mattress, a table with 2 chairs, a wood stove, a window that looked out toward the mountains, a mirror on the wall. Lydia stood in front of it for a long time. She barely recognized the woman looking back, thin, hollow-eyed. The bruise on her throat had faded to yellow. 3 months of running had stripped everything soft from her face and left behind only bone and determination. Then she looked down, and her blood went cold. A slip of paper on the floor. Someone had pushed it under the cabin door, before she arrived. Before Owen had given her the key. Someone had known she would be here. 4 words in a woman's handwriting. I know who you are. Owen Quillen did not believe in miracles. He believed in dirt and sweat and the hard certainty that this world would take everything you loved the second you stopped paying attention. He had built his life around that belief the way a man builds a fence around land he means to keep. Post by post, wire by wire. No gaps, no weak spots. Nothing gets in, nothing gets out. But something was getting in now. Something he had not planned for and did not know how to stop. Every morning for the past week, he had found himself standing outside the stable before dawn. Not checking on the horses, not doing his rounds, just standing there in the dark listening to Lydia hum that melody he could not name while she brushed Thunder and talked to the horse in a voice so low Owen could not make out the words. Just the tone, steady and gentle and sure. Like she was telling Thunder a secret that only the 2 of them would ever know. It was doing something to Owen. Something he did not want done. A crack forming in the wall he had spent 5 years building, a fracture running through the foundation of the man he had forced himself to become after Eli died. He shook the thought away the way he always did. Got to work. There was always work. That was the beauty of a ranch. The work never stopped, and as long as Owen kept moving, he did not have to feel anything except tired. But Lydia made it hard to keep moving past her. She did not just work with Thunder that first week. She worked with all 8 of the other horses. Owen watched from the hayloft and from behind the barn and from the porch of the main house, always keeping his distance, always pretending he had some other reason for being where he was. He watched her approach each animal differently. Some she spoke to right away. Others she let come to her the way she had with Thunder. One mare named Daisy, a skittish 3-year-old who had been spooked by a rattlesnake the month before, Lydia spent an entire afternoon just sitting on the fence rail humming while Daisy grazed nearby. By evening, the mare was eating out of her hand. When Owen asked how she knew what each horse needed, Lydia said something that stuck with him. My father learned from the Comanche, they do not break horses, they join them. You figure out what the horse is feeling and you match it. If the horse is scared, you are calm. If the horse is angry, you are patient. If the horse is lonely, you are present. That is all it is. Charlie Morrison overheard that from across the corral, and his face went tight. Charlie was 55 years old, had been with Owen's father before Owen took over the ranch. Had a scar down his left cheek from a Comanche arrow during a skirmish in Texas 20 years back. The word Comanche did not sit well with him. Indian methods, Charlie said. Not to Lydia, to Owen. Loud enough for Lydia to hear, but spoken to Owen because Charlie was smart enough to take his objections to the man who could do something about them. Boss, you are letting this woman teach Indian horse voodoo on your ranch. I am letting this woman do what she was hired to do, Owen said. And it is working. For now, Charlie said. Everything works for now. He walked away and Owen let him go because arguing with Charlie was like arguing with a fence post. The post did not move and you ended up with splinters. But later that day, Charlie caught Owen alone by the water trough and said something that cut deeper than any argument about horses. I see how you look at her, boss. Owen's hand stilled on the pump handle. I look at all my employees. Not like that, you do not. You have not looked at anyone that way since Eli. The name hit Owen like a fist to the chest. For a moment, everything inside him went still and cold and sharp. When he spoke, his voice was low, and it carried a warning that Charlie Morrison had heard exactly twice in 15 years. Do not ever say that name. Charlie held his ground. Old soldiers do not back down easy. But he saw something in Owen's eyes that made him nod once and turn away without another word. Owen stood by the water trough for a long time after Charlie left. His hand was on his forearm, on the scar. He did not realize he was touching it until he felt the raised ridge of skin under his fingers. That scar was from thunder. But the wound underneath it was from Eli. Everything was from Eli. Owen went back to work, mended a fence section that did not need mending, reorganized the tack room that was already organized, checked the grain stores twice. Anything to keep moving. Anything to keep the memories in the box where they belonged. It did not work. That afternoon, Owen made a decision that had nothing to do with logic, and everything to do with the thing he refused to name that was growing in his chest every time Lydia spoke. He went to the stable, took a saddle off the rack, walked into Thunder's stall. He was going to saddle that horse himself, without Lydia, without anyone. Because Owen Quillen did not need help, did not need a woman to do something he should have been able to do with his own 2 hands. Because if he could saddle Thunder on his own, then maybe he could prove to himself that Lydia was not as necessary as she was starting to feel. Thunder's ears went flat the moment Owen stepped toward him with the saddle. The horse shifted his weight. His eyes went dark. Owen saw the warning signs and ignored them, because he was angry and pride was louder than common sense. He lifted the saddle. Thunder exploded. The kick caught Owen in the ribs and sent him backward into the stable wall. He hit the wooden boards hard enough to see stars and slid to the ground with the wind knocked out of him and pain blooming through his left side like fire. He heard footsteps running. Then Lydia was there. She climbed over the stall door and dropped inside, and Owen waited for her to come to him, to kneel beside him and ask if he was all right. She went to Thunder first. She went straight to the horse, who was rearing and kicking and wild-eyed with panic, and she put herself between Owen and 1,200 pounds of terrified animal, and she did not flinch. She put her hands up, palms open, started making that sound, that low, steady hum, low, steady. Thunder's hooves came down, his ears went forward, his breathing slowed. Owen sat on the stable floor with at least one cracked rib and watched the woman he had been trying to prove he did not need do the thing he could not do. "You picked the horse over me," he said when he could breathe again. Lydia turned to look at him, no apology on her face. "The horse is panicking. You are just in pain. There is a difference." Owen stared at her. She stared back. And for a moment, neither of them breathed. She was right. That was the thing that dug into Owen like a splinter under the skin. She was absolutely right. And she was not afraid of him. Not afraid of his anger or his pride or the dark look that made every other person on this ranch step back and give him room. She stood in front of him and told him the truth and did not blink. He did not know what to do with that, so he did what he always did when he did not know what to do. He got up and walked away and pretended it did not matter. That night, Owen sat on the porch of the main house with a glass of whiskey he did not drink, and stared at the stars, and felt the ache in his ribs, and the deeper ache underneath. That had nothing to do with Thunder's kick. The memories came whether he wanted them or not. Eli, 16 years old, tall for his age, grinning the way boys grin when they think they are old enough to do a man's work. Standing at the edge of the porch in the fading light, saying the words that Owen heard every night in his sleep. "I can check it, Owen. Go get some sleep." Owen had been on his feet for 14 hours. His back hurt. His eyes were gritty with dust. The south fence line needed checking, and it was a 30-minute ride each way, and Owen was so tired he could barely see straight. So he nodded, said, "All right. Go on then, be careful." And Eli had grinned wider and grabbed his hat and headed for the corral, and Owen had gone inside and sat down at the table and closed his eyes. just for a minute, just to rest. He did not know how long he slept. Minutes, maybe. Maybe more. He woke to a sound, not a scream. Something worse. His name. Called once. Clear and calm. The way you say someone's name when you know they cannot reach you in time, but you want to hear your own voice say it one last time. Owen ran. Found Eli on the ground by the south fence with a diamondback coiled 3 feet away. 2 fang marks on the boy's right calf already swelling purple. Eli's face was white, but his eyes were open. He was not crying. Owen picked him up, carried him, ran for the house. The nearest doctor was 2 hours away on horseback. Owen did not have 2 hours. Eli died on the porch at sunset. In Owen's arms. The last thing he said was a lie told out of love. "Do not tell Ma you sent me. Tell her I went on my own." Owen buried his brother on the hill behind the ranch. Then he built a wall around his heart and swore he would never let anyone close enough to hurt like that again. 5 years. 5 years of that wall holding. 5 years of pushing people away. Mary Beth Henderson, who wanted to marry him. Friends who wanted to help. Charlie, who tried to talk sense. Owen pushed them all back because caring about someone meant putting them in danger. Caring meant losing, and losing meant a boy dying in your arms on a porch at sunset because you were too tired to check a fence yourself. Owen set down the whiskey glass and went inside and did not sleep. The next morning, Jake Fuller rode in from town with supplies and a piece of news that turned Owen's blood to ice water. "Someone's been asking around at the saloon," Jake told Charlie, while Owen stood within earshot, changing a horseshoe he had already changed twice. "Looking for a woman, blonde hair, traveling alone, might be using a false name, offering money for information." Charlie's eyes went to Owen. Owen's eyes went to the stable where Lydia was working with Thunder. "How much money?" Charlie asked. "Did not say, but enough to make the bartender pay attention." Owen finished the horseshoe, set down the hammer, walked to the main house without a word. That night he went to the stable past midnight. Habit. Checking. Making sure everything was where it was supposed to be. Lydia was not in her cabin. She was in Thunder's stall, curled up in the corner on the straw like a child trying to make herself invisible. The little knife lay in her open palm. Thunder stood over her, standing guard, his ears pricked forward. His eyes locked onto Owen the moment he appeared in the doorway. Owen stood still, looked at the knife, looked at the faded bruise on Lydia's wrist that the lantern light turned from yellow to shadow, looked at the way she slept with her knees pulled up and her back against the wall. The position of someone who has learned to protect their vital organs even in sleep. Whatever this woman had done, whatever she was running from, she had fought to survive. The question that kept Owen awake the rest of that night was not what she was running from. It was who had made her run. The slip of paper burned through Lydia's mind for 10 days. "I know who you are." 4 words. She studied every face on the ranch looking for the tell. The knowing glance, the slight smile that said, "I have leverage and I'm deciding when to use it." She watched Charlie Morrison with his open distrust, watched Jake Fuller with his easy grin, watched the younger hands whose names she was still learning. None of them showed a thing. That left Rosa. Rosa Delgado was the cook, had been with the Quillen family for 20 years. She was 58 years old with gray streaked black hair and hands that were rough from decades of kneading dough and scrubbing pots and doing the 1,000 invisible things that kept a ranch running. She spoke English with a Sonoran accent, and occasionally lapsed into Spanish when she was angry or amused or talking to herself. She watched everything and said little. She reminded Lydia of a hawk sitting on a fence post, still and patient and missing nothing. On the 10th day after finding the note, Lydia decided she was done waiting. Waiting was what prey did. She was finished being prey. She walked into the kitchen at mid-morning when Rosa was alone, set the slip of paper on the flour-dusted table. Said nothing, just stood there and watched. Rosa looked at the paper, looked at Lydia. Not one flicker of surprise crossed her face, not 1 second of confusion. She had been expecting this. "You wrote it," Lydia said. "I did." "Why?" Rosa set down the ball of dough she had been working, wiped her hands on her apron. When she spoke, her voice was steady and quiet, and carried the weight of something lived rather than learned. "I saw the signs. The way you jump when a door closes hard. The way you always sit closest to the way out. The way you check the window before you put out the lamp at night. The way you carry a knife even though you are on a ranch full of men who would protect you if you asked." She paused, met Lydia's eyes. "I know those signs because I used to do all those things. 30 years ago, I ran from a man in Sonora who believed that a wife was property. I ran with nothing but the dress on my back, and I did not stop until I reached California. Owen's father gave me a job, gave me a safe place. I have been here ever since." Lydia felt something crack inside her chest. Not the walls she had built, something deeper, something older. The loneliness. The terrible, grinding loneliness of being the only person in the world who knew what you had survived. "I did not write that note to threaten you," Rosa said. "I wrote it so you would know. At least one person here understands." Lydia sat down at the table. Her legs felt weak in a way they had not felt since the night she ran. Rosa poured her coffee without being asked and sat down across from her, and for a moment neither of them spoke. They did not need to. Some conversations happen in the silence between two people who have carried the same kind of weight. "You cannot lie to Owen forever," Rosa said finally. "I do not know what you are hiding, and I am not asking. That is your business. But you need to know something about that man if you are going to stay here." "What?" "He hates dishonesty more than anything on this earth. He hates it because he has been lying to himself for 5 years about his brother, and the lie is eating him alive." "His brother," Lydia said. Rosa told her. Not the short version. Not the version Charlie had alluded to. The full story, every detail. Eli was 16, tall and eager and desperate to prove he was grown. Owen sent him to check the south fence line alone because Owen was too tired to go himself. It was almost dark. Diamond-back rattlesnake country. Owen knew that. Knew it, and sent the boy anyway because exhaustion makes you stupid and stupid gets people killed. Eli was bitten. Owen heard him call. Not a scream, just his name. Once. Calm. The calm was the worst part because it meant the boy knew. Owen ran to him, picked him up, carried him on his back, racing for the house. But the nearest doctor was a 2-hour ride, and the venom was already in Eli's blood, turning it to poison. The boy died on the porch. In Owen's arms. The sun was going down and the sky was red and orange and beautiful in the way the sky is sometimes beautiful when terrible things are happening underneath it. And the last thing Eli said was this: "Do not tell Ma you sent me. Tell her I went on my own." Lydia closed her eyes. She understood now. She understood the wall Owen had built around himself, the need for control, the way he pushed people away. He was not protecting himself from being hurt. He was protecting other people from being hurt by him, because in Owen's mind, caring about someone was the same as putting them in danger. Loving someone was the same as killing them. "He is a good man," Rosa said, "but he is a broken one. And broken men do broken things when they are afraid. If he finds out you have been lying to him, it will not be the lie that hurts him. It will be that you did not trust him enough to tell the truth. That is the one thing Owen Quillen cannot forgive, because it is the one thing he cannot forgive in himself." Lydia opened her eyes. "What do I do?" "You tell him the truth, when you're ready, before someone else does it for you. And if the truth makes him send me away." Rosa looked at her for a long time. "Then at least you will know you left standing up instead of running." They sat in the kitchen and drank their coffee, and Lydia felt something she had not felt in 3 months. Not safety, exactly. Something closer to possibility. The idea that maybe this place could be more than a hiding spot. Maybe it could be a beginning. That afternoon, Owen came to the stable while Lydia was working with Thunder. He had the saddle in his hands. This time he did not try to do it alone. He stood outside the stall and waited for Lydia to tell him when. She talked him through it, step by step, how to stand, where to look, how to breathe, how to let Thunder see the saddle without making the horse feel trapped. Owen listened, actually listened, not pretending, not humoring her. Listening the way a man listens when he has figured out that someone else knows more than he does, and he is not too proud to learn. When the saddle was on and Thunder was standing calm with his ears forward, Owen's hand rested on the horse's neck. Lydia's hand was on the other side. Their fingers brushed across Thunder's mane, just barely. The touch of skin on skin lasting less than a second. Both of them pulled away. Owen because he was afraid of what he felt. Lydia because she was afraid of what she wanted to feel. Late that afternoon, a rider came through. Stopped at the ranch gate. Asked Jake for directions to San Bernardino. Nothing unusual about that. Riders came through all the time. But Lydia saw him from the stable and she vanished. 1 second she was brushing a mare by the water trough in plain sight. The next she was gone. Disappeared into the shadows of the stable the way a rabbit disappears into a hole when a hawk's shadow crosses the ground. Owen saw it. He was standing by the main house, and he saw Lydia vanish, and he saw the rider at the gate, and he saw the rider's eyes drift toward the stable, lingering. The way a man's eyes linger when he is looking for something specific and thinks he might have found it. The rider left. Owen watched him go. Then he went into the house and opened the drawer beside his bed and took out his Colt revolver and cleaned it for the first time in 6 months. Wiped it down, oiled the cylinder, loaded it, set it on the bedside table. He did not know what shape the danger would take. But 15 years on the frontier had taught him to trust the feeling in his gut that said trouble was coming. And his gut said it was coming for her. Owen Quillen did not believe in love at first sight. He had always figured that was something poets made up to sell books and preachers used to fill pews on Sunday mornings. He believed in the kind of feeling that builds slow and quiet like a fire inside a stone. You do not see it, do not feel its heat. Then one day you pick up that stone and it burns your hand and you realize it has been burning the whole time. You just were not paying attention. He was paying attention now. That was the problem. 3 weeks since Lydia arrived, 3 weeks of watching her work and listening to her talk to the horses and catching himself thinking about the color of her eyes at odd moments during the day. Green like new sage, green like spring, green like something growing in a place that had been dry for too long. He told himself it was nothing. Told himself he was just impressed by her skill with the horses. Told himself any man would notice a woman who could do what Lydia did. None of it was true, and he knew it, and that knowledge sat in his chest like a stone on fire. Then the mountain lion came, and everything he had been pretending stopped mattering. It was a Tuesday morning, clear sky, cool for August in San Bernardino, which meant it was only hot enough to make you wish for water instead of hot enough to make you pray for it. Owen was riding the western fence line with Lydia. He had asked her to come along to check on Daisy, the skittish mare who was pastured out that way. That was his excuse, anyway. The truth was, he wanted her company, and he was running out of lies to tell himself about why. They were riding side by side along the ridge when Daisy screamed. It was not a normal sound. Horses make a lot of noises. Nickers and whinnies and snorts, and the heavy breathing of hard work. What Daisy made was a scream, high and sharp and full of blind terror. Owen saw the mountain lion the same moment Lydia did. It was crouched on a rocky outcrop above the fence line. Big, tawny fur, muscles coiled like springs. Its eyes were fixed on Daisy, who was already bolting, running blind with fear straight toward the ravine that dropped 40 feet to the rocks below. Owen reached for his rifle, but Lydia was already moving. She kicked her horse forward and cut across the pasture at a dead run, angling to get between Daisy and the ravine edge. Owen shouted her name. She did not hear him or did not care. She reached Daisy 10 yards from the drop-off, threw herself off her horse, landed on her feet, put herself directly in the path of 1,200 pounds of panicking animal. She spread her arms wide, waved her coat over her head, shouted, not words, just sound, loud and sharp and authoritative. Daisy skidded, turned, changed direction, ran along the fence line instead of over the edge. Owen fired his rifle into the air, once, twice. The mountain lion flinched, looked at him, looked at Lydia, decided it was not worth the trouble and vanished over the rocks. Then it was quiet, the kind of quiet that follows a near disaster, the world catching its breath. Owen dismounted. His hands were shaking. Not from the mountain lion, from watching Lydia throw herself in front of a panicked horse and a 40-foot drop without hesitation. From the 2 seconds where he thought she was going to go over the edge. 2 seconds, during which his heart stopped beating and his lungs stopped working, and everything inside him screamed one word: no, not again. He walked to where Lydia was standing. She was breathing hard. Her dress was torn at the hem and there was a scrape on her forearm where she had landed on the rocks. But she was smiling, actually smiling, as if nearly dying was just another Tuesday. "Are you out of your mind?" Owen said. His voice was not steady. "Daisy would have gone over, and you nearly went with her. But I did not. But you could have." Owen's hands were still shaking. He clenched them into fists and pressed them against his legs and willed them to stop. They did not stop. Lydia saw. She did not mention it. But she saw. Something opened up inside Owen then. Something he had been keeping locked and bolted for 5 years. Not a door, more like a wound. The realization hit him with the force of thunder's kick. He cared about this woman. Not the way you care about an employee or a neighbor or a friend. He cared the way you care about someone whose absence would leave a hole in the world that nothing else could fill. And that terrified him. Because the last time Owen Quillen cared about someone that much, he ended up holding a dead boy on a porch at sunset. The days that followed were the worst Owen had experienced since Eli died. Not because anything bad happened, because something good was happening and he did not know how to let it. He lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, trying to talk himself out of what he felt. The arguments were solid. She was hiding something. She had lied about her name. Someone was looking for her, and that meant danger. Getting close to her meant risking everything he had built, risking not just his heart, but his ranch and his men and the life that was the only thing standing between him and the darkness that had swallowed him after Eli. So he did the only thing that made sense to the broken part of his brain. He decided to send her away. He found her in the stable the next morning. She was brushing Thunder. The horse was calm. The morning light was coming through the boards. Everything was golden and peaceful, and Owen was about to destroy it. "Your trial period is done," he said. Flat voice, granite face. "You can pick up your wages from Charlie. I wish you well." Lydia's hand stopped on Thunder's neck. She turned slowly, looked at him, reading him the way she read the horses, looking past the words to the thing underneath. "Why?" she said. "Because the trial is over, and I have made my decision. That is not a reason. That is a sentence. Why are you sending me away?" Owen's jaw tightened. "I do not owe you an explanation." "No, you do not. But I think you owe yourself one." The air between them went tight. Thunder shifted his weight. His ears rotated. He could feel the tension the way horses always can. Animals know when the humans around them are lying, even when the humans do not know it themselves. Lydia set down the brush, took a step toward Owen. Not aggressive, not pleading, direct. "You know what is worse than being sent away," she said. "Being sent away not because you did something wrong, but because the person sending you is scared. Owen's eyes went hard. I am not scared of anything. My father taught me that a horse pushes you out of its space not because it hates you, but because it has been hurt too many times and does not dare trust again. She paused. You are thunder, Owen. You just do not know it. Owen stood there. The words hit him somewhere deep and true and terrible. He opened his mouth to argue and nothing came out because there was nothing to say. She was right. She was right the way she had been right about the horse panicking and him just being in pain. She saw through him the way she saw through the horses, straight to the fear underneath the anger. He left without a word, walked to the barn, sat on a hay bale, stared at his hands, felt the wall inside him shaking, not falling, not yet, but shaking. Charlie found him there an hour later. The old man sat down beside him without being asked. They sat in silence for a while, then Charlie spoke. I do not like her, Charlie said. I have made that clear, but I'm going to say something you are not going to want to hear, and you are going to listen because I have earned the right. Owen said nothing. Charlie took that as permission. You pushed Mary Beth away. Before that, you pushed Cal Hennessy away. He was the best friend you ever had, and you have not spoken to him in 3 years. You push everyone who gets close because you are scared that caring about someone means losing them. And maybe it does. Maybe it does mean that. But the alternative is dying alone on this ranch with nothing but cattle and a horse that hates you. Is that what you want? Because that is where you are headed. Owen stared at the floor. I do not like her, Charlie said again. But I have not seen you smile in 5 years. Not once. And yesterday, when she was telling that story about the Mustang her father caught barehanded, you smiled. I saw it, and it made me realize how long it has been. So do what you want, boss. Send her away if that is what you need to do. But know what you are sending away. Because I do not think you will get another chance like this. Charlie stood up, dusted off his pants, walked out. Owen sat there for a long time. Then he went to the main house, opened a drawer, took out a key. Not the temporary key he had given Lydia when she arrived. A different one. The permanent one. The one that meant this is yours for as long as you want it. He found Lydia in her cabin packing her bag. She had a single bag. Everything she owned in the world fit inside it. That fact made Owen's chest ache in a way he was not prepared for. He did not apologize. He did not explain. He held out the key. Lydia looked at it. Looked at him. Her hand came up slowly and took it from his palm, and Owen saw her fingers tremble. Not from cold. Not from fear. From something else entirely. Stay, Owen said. One word. The hardest word he had spoken in 5 years. Lydia closed her fingers around the key and nodded, and Owen felt the wall inside him crack. Lydia had been counting. 47 lies since the day she walked onto the Quillen Ranch. Her name was a lie. Her hometown was a lie. The story about her father dying of fever was a lie. He had died of a broken heart after the bank took his land. But the fever sounded more dignified, and Lydia had learned that dignity was something you could build out of fiction when the truth was too ugly to show. 47 lies, some small, some enormous, all of them stacking up between her and the man she was falling for like bricks in a wall she could not stop building. Because that was the cruel irony of it. The lies were supposed to protect her. Instead, they were building a prison. Every time Owen looked at her with those dark, steady eyes and said something real, something honest, something that cost him to say, Lydia felt the wall get higher. Because he was giving her truth, and she was giving him fabrication, and the imbalance was going to crush them both eventually. She knew that. She just did not know how to stop. It was a Wednesday in late September, 6 weeks since she had arrived. The mornings were getting cooler. The light had changed the way it does in California when summer starts letting go. Golden instead of white. Softer. Kinder. Owen asked her to ride the western fence with him. She said yes before he finished the sentence. They both knew the fence did not need checking. They both knew this was something else. Neither of them said it. They rode in silence for a while. Not the uncomfortable silence of people who do not know what to say. The comfortable silence of people who have run out of small talk and are ready for something bigger. They stopped on the ridge above the valley. San Bernardino spread out below them. The mountains rising blue and permanent in the distance. The wind carried sage and dust and the faint, clean smell of distant rain. Owen spoke first. He told her about Eli. Not the short version, not the version that ended with the snake bite and moved on. The long version, the one with details. How Eli used to whistle while he worked. How he wanted to be a school teacher when he grew up, which was funny for a ranch kid. But Eli loved books the way other boys loved horses. How the last morning of his life he had made coffee for Owen without being asked, and it was terrible coffee, too strong and bitter as medicine. But Owen drank every drop because Eli was so proud of making it. Owen's voice stayed level through all of it, controlled. But his knuckles were white on the reins and the muscle in his jaw was working like he was chewing something that would not go down. Lydia listened. She did not say, "I understand." Did not say it was not your fault. Did not say any of the things people say when they do not know what else to offer. She sat beside him on her horse and let the silence hold the weight of his words. When he was done, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said something she had not planned to say. Something that came from the place inside her, where the truth still lived even after 47 lies. I did something I cannot take back. And I do not know if I am a good person or a bad person for doing it. Owen looked at her. His eyes were wet, but he was not crying. Men like Owen Quillen did not cry. They just got wet around the edges and pretended it was the wind. I do not know if I am good or bad either, he said. But I know I want to try harder when I am around you. Lydia felt the wall between them shake. Not from Owen's side, from hers. Because what he had just said was the most honest thing anyone had said to her in years. And she was sitting there with a false name and a false history, and a rifle blast echoing in her memory that she had not told him about. She wanted to tell him everything. Right then. On that ridge with the valley spread out below and the mountains standing witness. She wanted to say, "My name is not Voss. It is Hargrove. And I shot my husband 3 months ago because he was going to kill me. And I do not know if he is alive or dead. And there might be a warrant out for my arrest. And I'm telling you now because you deserve the truth. And I am tired of building this wall between us brick by lying brick." She almost said it. The words were on her tongue, ready. But then she looked at Owen's face, at the pain that was still there from talking about Eli, at the trust in his eyes, the fragile new trust that had cost him so much to offer. And she thought about what Rosa had said. If he finds out you have been lying, it will not be the lie that hurts him. It will be that you did not trust him enough to tell the truth. She was afraid. Afraid that the truth would make him look at her differently. Afraid that the woman who shot a man in the dark was not the woman Owen was falling for. Afraid that Lydia Hargrove was someone Owen Quillen would not want to know. So she said nothing, swallowed the truth back down, added number 48 to the count. What she did instead was lean toward him, slowly, giving him time to pull back. He did not pull back. She kissed him. It was not a perfect kiss. It was clumsy and unsure, and they bumped noses, and she tasted salt from the tears he would not admit were there. He kissed like a man who had forgotten how. She kissed like a woman who was trying to remember that not every touch ended in pain. But it was real. It was the most real thing that had happened between them. And when they pulled apart, they were both breathing hard and both smiling, and the wall was still there, but for one moment it did not matter. They rode back to the ranch, Owen ahead, Lydia behind. The sun was going down, and the sky was doing that thing it does in California, where it turns every color at once, gold and orange and pink and purple, all layered on top of each other like God could not decide which one was prettiest, and figured he would use them all. Owen was lightheaded. drunk on something that had nothing to do with whiskey. He had kissed a woman for the first time in 5 years, had told her about Eli, had let someone pass the wall, and the world had not ended. The sky was still there. The mountains were still there. The ranch was still there. Maybe Charlie was right. Maybe letting someone in did not have to mean losing them. He was thinking about that. Thinking about possibility. About the future. About the word tomorrow meaning something good for the first time in longer than he could remember. Then he saw the paper. It was caught on the fence wire near the ranch gate, wind blown, flapping in the breeze like a wounded bird. Owen dismounted and pulled it free and unfolded it, and the world that had not ended 5 minutes ago ended now. A drawing of a woman's face, not perfect but close enough. Dark blonde hair, pale eyes, the shape of the jaw and the line of the cheekbones recognizable if you knew who you were looking at. Below the drawing, 3 lines of text. Wanted for murder. Lydia Hargrove. $200 reward. Owen stood in the wind holding that poster and felt every good thing that had been building inside him for the past 6 weeks collapse like a barn in a storm. He had kissed this woman 20 minutes ago, had told her about Eli, the thing he had not told a living soul in 5 years, and she had sat there, looking at him with those green eyes, while the name she had given him was not even hers. Owen tore the poster in half, then in quarters, shoved the pieces into his coat pocket, walked into the house, sat at the dining table in the dark, stared at the chair where Lydia sat every morning drinking coffee and telling him lies with that beautiful lying mouth. The whiskey was on the shelf. He did not touch it. He needed his head clear. He sat there until the last light was gone from the windows. Then he opened the drawer and took out his Colt and set it on the table next to the torn pieces of the wanted poster and looked at both of them and wondered which one could do more damage. Owen did not sleep for 3 days. During the day he worked, mended fences, moved cattle, did everything a ranch owner was supposed to do. But his eyes kept finding Lydia. In the stable, by the water trough, walking between the cabin and the corral with that quiet grace that had nothing to do with trying and everything to do with who she was. He watched her brush Thunder's mane and tried to find the killer in those gentle fingers. He could not find her. And that was the worst part, because it meant he was looking at a woman he loved. He could admit that now. Loved. He loved her. And everything he loved about her might be built on a lie. She knew something was wrong. He could tell by the way she watched him. The careful sidelong glances. The way she started to say something at meals and then stopped. She thought he regretted the kiss. She thought he was pulling back into his shell the way he always did. She had no idea. On the 3rd night, Owen made his decision. He could not live with the not knowing. The truth was a knife in his chest, and the only way to pull it out was to push it through. He went to her cabin after supper, knocked once. She opened the door and he saw the hope in her face. The hope that he was there because he wanted to be. Because he had come to tell her something good. He set the torn pieces of the wanted poster on her table, smoothed them flat so the drawing was visible, so the name was readable, so the word murder was staring up at both of them like an accusation. Lydia Hargrove, Owen said. That is your real name. The hope died in her eyes. He watched it go. Watched it replaced by something harder and older. Not surprise. She had been waiting for this. Some part of her had known it was coming the way you know a storm is coming when the air goes heavy and the birds stop singing. She did not deny it, did not cry, did not beg. She sat down at the table and looked at the torn poster, and then looked at Owen, and when she spoke, her voice was steady. She told him everything. Robert Hargrove, her husband, former soldier, the kind of man who could charm a room full of strangers and terrify the woman waiting at home. He did not start with hitting. They never do. He started with words, with control, what she wore, who she spoke to. When she was allowed to leave the house, The walls closed in so slowly she did not realize she was trapped until the first time he locked her in the root cellar for talking to the postman. The cellar was dark and cold and smelled like earth and potatoes and fear. 4 days the first time, 2 days the second. By the third time, she stopped counting. Then came the hitting. Open hand at first, then closed fist, then whatever was nearby. A belt, a boot. Once a piece of firewood that cracked her forearm, and she had to set the bone herself because Robert would not let her see a doctor. The last night. He came home drunk, drunker than usual. Something had gone wrong at the card table in town, and he needed someone to pay for it, and that someone was always her. He took the kitchen knife from the block, the one with the wooden handle, held it up where she could see it. "I am going to teach you a lesson you will carry the rest of your life." She saw it in his eyes, not anger. Something past anger, something final. He was going to kill her. Not on purpose, maybe. Maybe he just meant to cut her. But the look in his eyes said he had stopped caring where the line was between hurting and killing, and she was going to find out which side of that line she landed on. The rifle was on the wall. Robert had hung it there himself. Lydia reached for it. Her hands were shaking, but her aim was steady because her father had taught her to shoot. And some things your body remembers even when your mind is screaming. She fired. The blast was louder than anything she had ever heard. Robert went down. She did not check if he was breathing, did not check for a pulse, did not do anything except run. "I do not know if he is alive or dead," Lydia said. Her voice had not cracked. Not once. "I did not stop to find out. I ran. 3 months, 5 states, changed my name twice, and I ended up here." She looked at Owen, green eyes dry and fierce. "And I will not apologize for choosing to survive." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Owen had ever heard. Louder than the rifle blast she described. Louder than the memory of Eli calling his name. He understood. God help him, he understood. He looked at this woman who had been beaten and locked in a cellar and terrorized by a man who was supposed to protect her. He looked at the scars he could see, and imagined the ones he could not. He understood why she ran, why she lied, why she slept with a knife in her hand and checked the exits of every room she entered. He understood all of it, and it did not help. "You lied to me," Owen said. His voice was quiet, not angry. Worse than angry, hurt. "Every single day, every single moment you have been on this ranch. When I told you about Eli, the thing I have never told another living soul, you sat there and you lied to me about your own name. I had to. I know you had to. That does not make it hurt less." Lydia flinched. The first time he had ever seen her flinch at words instead of fists. Owen stood up. He could not stay in this room, could not look at her face and see both the woman he loved and the woman who had lied to him every day for 6 weeks. Both were real, both were true, and he did not know how to hold them in his hands at the same time. "Stay," he said, "until I figure out what to do. But do not come near me." He left the cabin, closed the door behind him, walked into the dark. Lydia sat at the table for a long time after he was gone. She looked at the torn poster, at her own face staring back at her from the cheap paper. Lydia Hargrove, wanted for murder. Then she stood up, went to the bed, pulled out the bag she kept packed underneath it. The go bag, the running bag, knife in the boot, hair tied tight, dark coat. She was halfway through packing when thunder called from the stable, long and mournful, the same sound she had heard the first night. The sound that had pulled her off the road and through the fence and into a stable where she found a horse that needed her. Lydia stopped packing, stood there with a spare dress in her hands and listened to that sound, and felt something shift inside her. Not break, shift. Like a bone that has been set wrong finally moving into the right position. It hurt. But it was the kind of hurt that means healing. She put the dress back, set the bag on the floor, sat on the edge of the bed. For 3 years she had been running. 3 years of false names and strange beds, and looking over her shoulder every time she heard footsteps behind her. 3 years of being someone else because being herself was too dangerous. She was tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep fixes. The kind that goes all the way down to your bones. The kind that comes from carrying a weight so long you have forgotten what it feels like to stand up straight. She was tired of running, tired of lying, tired of being the woman who always left before anyone could leave her. So she stayed, set the bag down, lay on the bed, closed her eyes. For the first time in 3 years, she chose to face what was coming instead of running from it. Not for Owen, for herself. She was done being the woman who ran. The next morning, Charlie knocked on her cabin door before the sun was up. His face was white under the weathered tan. His eyes were hard with something that looked like fear, and Charlie Morrison was not a man who wore fear easily. "There is a man rode into town last night," Charlie said. "Calls himself a bounty hunter. Has a poster with your face on it." Lydia felt the blood drain from her face. "And this morning," Charlie said, "he is having coffee with Sheriff Martinez." Owen smelled the danger before he saw the man. It was a particular smell. Dust from a long, hard road. Horse leather soaked through with old sweat. And underneath it, something else. Something that had nothing to do with travel and everything to do with intent. The cold, patient self-assurance of a man who made his living finding people who did not want to be found. The figure appeared at the ranch gate just after noon, riding a bay gelding that looked as road-worn as its rider. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, had the kind of face that was handsome once before something soured it. Dark hair going gray at the temples, a scar on his left shoulder visible through the open collar of his shirt. He sat his horse with a military bearing, straight back, eyes forward, hands relaxed on the reins but ready for anything. Owen walked to the gate with Charlie flanking him on the right and Jake on the left. He did not draw his weapon. Not yet. But his hand rested on his hip close enough to the Colt that the message was clear. "Help you," Owen said. The man smiled. It was a professional smile, the kind a man practices in a mirror until it looks sincere. "Name is Robert Graves. I am a licensed bounty hunter working a warrant out of Kansas. Looking for a woman named Lydia Hargrove. Wanted for murder." He reached into his coat and produced a folded document. Held it out. Owen took it, unfolded it, read it. The paper was official looking. Bore what appeared to be a court stamp from Leavenworth County, Kansas. The language was formal and legalistic. The charge was murder in the first degree. Owen looked at the warrant. Looked at the man calling himself Graves. Noticed 2 things. First, the man said, "This woman, not my wife." He was hiding the personal connection. Question was why. Second, the scar on his shoulder, left side. Round entry wound with ragged edges. The kind a rifle bullet makes going in. Owen handed the warrant back. "I do not know any Lydia Hargrove," he said. Robert Graves smiled again. Same practiced smile. "Respectfully, Mr. Quillen, I think you do. I have been tracking this woman across 5 states. The trail led here, to your ranch. I have witnesses in town who say a blonde woman matching her description has been working with your horses for the past several weeks." Owen's face did not change. "I have a horse handler named Lydia Voss. Is that the woman you mean?" "That would be her, using a false name, as fugitives tend to do." Charlie shifted his weight beside Owen. Jake's hand moved closer to his side. The air at the gate was getting thick with the kind of tension that comes before something breaks. "I do not mean any trouble," Robert said, voice smooth as oiled leather. "Just doing my job. The papers are in order. Law is on my side. I figure you are a decent man. I am sure you do not want to be harboring a wanted killer. Owen held the man's eyes. You are welcome to take your papers to Sheriff Martinez. If the law says she needs to go with you, then the law says what the law says. But you are not setting foot on my property until a judge weighs in. Something flickered behind Robert's eyes, quick and gone, like lightning behind clouds. He did not like being told no, but he covered it well. Fair enough, Robert said. Judge Hale is due through in 2 weeks, I believe. I can wait. I am a patient man. He turned his horse, then stopped, looked over his shoulder. One more thing, Mr. Quillen. I would not let her run if I were you. A woman who killed her husband in his sleep is capable of most anything. He rode off toward town. Owen watched him go. Then he turned and walked fast toward the sheriff's office in San Bernardino. Charlie and Jake stayed at the gate. Sheriff Martinez was a stocky man with a thick black mustache and the kind of eyes that had seen enough to stop being surprised by anything. He listened to Owen's account, looked at the warrant Robert had shown him that morning, rubbed his mustache. Papers look real, Martinez said. I cannot just ignore a murder warrant from another state. I'm not asking you to ignore it. I'm asking you to hold off until Judge Hale gets here. Let the woman have her hearing. Let the judge decide. And in the meantime, she stays on my ranch, house arrest. I will put up my land as bond. She does not leave the property. If she runs, I forfeit everything. Martinez looked at him for a long time. That is a lot of ranch to gamble on a woman accused of murder. I know what I am gambling. Do you? Owen met the sheriff's eyes and held them. I do. Martinez nodded slowly. All right. She stays on your property. Does not leave for any reason. If she runs, you lose the ranch. And that bounty hunter stays in town. I will keep an eye on him. Owen rode back to the ranch. Found Robert waiting outside the gate like a man who had nowhere to be, and all the time in the world. He was leaning against his horse, picking dirt from under his fingernails with a pocket knife. Casual, relaxed, the posture of a man who knows the game is rigged in his favor. Got my deal with the sheriff, Owen said. She stays here until the judge comes. Figured as much. Like I said, I am a patient man. Owen started to ride past him. Robert's voice stopped him. Mr. Quillen, can I ask you something? Man to man. Owen did not turn around. Ask. What did she tell you? About me? Owen said nothing. Let me guess. She told you I beat her, that she was scared for her life, that she had no choice. Robert's voice changed, dropped lower, shed its professional polish like a snake shedding skin. She shot me in my sleep. I was lying in bed with my eyes closed, and she put a rifle bullet through my shoulder. Does that sound like self-defense to you? Owen's hands tightened on the reins. He still did not turn around. She is good at making people believe her, Robert continued. She made me believe she loved me. For 2 years. Turned out the only thing she loved was my money. And when that ran out, she tried to kill me. If all of that is true, Owen said, you have nothing to worry about. The judge will see it your way. I reckon he will. I just wanted you to know, so you are not surprised when it happens. Owen rode through the gate without looking back. But Robert's words followed him, burrowed into his brain like a tick. She shot me in my sleep. What if that was true? What if Lydia's version of events was the lie and Robert's was the truth? Owen had believed Lydia because he wanted to believe her, because believing her meant the woman he loved was justified, was innocent, was the victim and not the villain. But want was not evidence. And Owen had learned the hardest way possible that believing what you want to believe instead of what is true can get people killed. That night, Owen did something he hated. He went to Lydia's cabin, not to talk, not to comfort, not to hold her hand and tell her everything would be fine. He went to watch her face when he told her what Robert had said. "He says you shot him in his sleep," Owen said. Lydia's face went still, not surprised, not guilty, still, the way the surface of a pond goes still before something rises from the bottom. "He's lying," she said. "He has a bullet wound in his shoulder that says someone shot him. I shot him. I never said I did not. But he was not sleeping. He was standing in front of me with a knife. I told you what happened. You told me a lot of things. Not all of them were true." The words landed like stones. Lydia absorbed them without flinching. She had taken worse from Robert. Words from a man who was struggling with his own trust were nothing compared to fists from a man who had none. "You are right," she said. "I lied about my name, about my past, about almost everything. But I did not lie about that night. And I did not lie about what I feel for you." Owen looked at her for a long time. Then he turned and left. He lay awake that night, staring at the darkness above his bed. Lydia said he had a knife. Robert said he was sleeping. One of them was lying. Both of them were capable of it. But there was one detail that stuck in Owen's mind like a burr in a saddle blanket. A detail he kept circling back to. Robert knew Owen had kissed Lydia. He had said it at the gate that first day. "You have been kissing her. How did he know that?" Owen had kissed Lydia on the ridge, miles from town, no one else around, which meant Robert had been watching before he showed up at the gate, before he announced himself to the sheriff. He had been out there in the hills watching the ranch through a spyglass or from the tree line, patient, methodical, the way a hunter watches prey. Bounty hunters do not stalk. They serve papers and make arrests. Hunters stalk. Soldiers stalk. Former soldiers who know how to track stalk. Owen sat up in bed. His mind was working now, pulling threads. The scar on Robert's shoulder, left side, a rifle bullet. Lydia said she grabbed the rifle off the wall. Robert said he was sleeping. If Robert was sleeping, the shot would have hit him in the chest or the back, depending on which way he was facing in bed. Not the shoulder, not the front of the left shoulder, at an angle that suggested the shooter was below him, standing while he was standing, facing him. The angle of a wound from a woman on her feet, shooting at a man coming toward her with a knife. Owen did not sleep the rest of that night, but when the sun came up, he knew which version of events he believed. Not because he wanted to believe it, because the evidence told him to. Lydia woke on what might be the last morning she would ever spend at the Quillen Ranch and realized something that surprised her. She was not afraid, not calm exactly. Her heart was beating faster than she would have liked, and her hands were not entirely steady. But the paralyzing fear that had driven her for 3 months was gone, replaced by something harder and cleaner. Resolve. She was done running, done hiding, done letting other people decide what happened to her. Whatever came today, she would face it on her feet with her eyes open and her voice steady. She dressed, braided her hair, left the knife in her boot because some habits die harder than others. Walked to the stable. Thunder was awake, pacing, restless. He could feel it too, something coming. The horse pressed his nose against her shoulder and she leaned into him, and for a moment let herself draw strength from the animal that had been her first friend in this place. "Come on," she told him. "You are coming with me today. I am not leaving you here alone." She saddled Thunder and led him to the main house just as Owen was coming down the steps. He looked like he had not slept, dark circles under his eyes, jaw clenched tight. But there was something else in his face that had not been there the day before. A decision, made and settled. The look of a man who has chosen his side. "Judge Hale rode in early," Owen said. "Robert got word to him. Hearing is in 2 hours, at the saloon." Lydia nodded. "I talked to Martinez. He will keep it orderly." "But Lydia, there is no lawyer in this town. The judge will hear both sides and make his ruling." "I know. I can speak for you. Testify on your character." Lydia looked at him, really looked, at the man who had taken her in, given her work, given her a key, told her about his brother, kissed her on a ridge, then found out she was a wanted woman and still put up his land to keep her safe. "I need you there," she said, "but I do not need you to save me. I need you to believe me. Those are two different things." Owen was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. Once. The nod of a man who understands the difference. They rode into San Bernardino together. Owen on his horse, Lydia on Thunder, Charlie and Jake behind them. The saloon was already full when they arrived. Word had spread the way word does in a small town. Everyone wanted to see the hearing. Ranchers from neighboring properties, shopkeepers, the barber, the blacksmith. Half the town packed into a room that smelled like spilled beer and sawdust and judgment. Judge Solomon Hale sat behind the bar. He was 65 years old, with a face like crumpled leather, and eyes that had seen more frontier justice than anyone should have to. He was not an unkind man, but he was not a soft one either. The law was the law, and he applied it without sentiment. Robert Hargrove sat at a table near the front, still calling himself Graves, still wearing the bounty hunter disguise. His face was composed, professional. He had his papers arranged neatly in front of him. He looked like a man who had already won and was just waiting for the formality to conclude. Sheriff Martinez stood by the door, arms crossed, watching everything. Judge Hale called the hearing to order. "I understand we have a matter regarding a warrant from Kansas. Mr. Graves, state your case." Robert stood, spoke clearly and calmly, laid out the facts as he wanted them understood. Lydia Hargrove, wanted for murder. Shot her husband while he slept. Fled across state lines, used false names. Had been located at the Quillen Ranch, working under the alias Lydia Voss. The warrant was valid. The evidence was the bullet wound in his shoulder, which he displayed by pulling his shirt aside. The request was simple: remand the accused into his custody for transport to Kansas. Judge Hale listened without expression, nodded, turned to Lydia. "Miss Hargrove, or Mrs. Hargrove, as the case may be, what is your response?" Lydia stood. The saloon went quiet, every eye on her. She could feel them, the curiosity, the judgment. The men who had already decided she was guilty, and the few who had not decided yet. She told the truth, all of it, from the beginning. She told them about the courtship that turned into a cage, the words that turned into fists, the cellar that turned into a prison. She spoke calmly and clearly without tears or theatrics. She described the bruises, the broken arm she set herself, the burns from cigars put out on her skin. Then she did something that made the whole room hold its breath. She untied the scarf from her neck, rolled up her sleeves, stood there in front of the judge and the town, and the man who had done it all, and let them see. Scars, old and new, layered over each other like a map of violence. Circular burns on her forearms, a long, thin line down her left arm from a kitchen knife. Marks across her wrists where she had been tied, faded bruises on her throat in the shape of fingers. The saloon was silent, the kind of silence that comes when a room full of people confront something they do not want to believe is real. Judge Hale looked at the scars. His face remained neutral, but his eyes had changed, harder now, focused. "Can anyone corroborate these injuries?" he asked. "Any witness who can testify to the abuse?" Lydia opened her mouth. Before she could speak, a voice came from the back of the room. "I can." Rosa Delgado stood up from a chair near the door. She walked forward, placed something on the bar in front of the judge, a shirt, white cotton, stained brown and black on the back. "When she first came to the ranch, I washed her clothes. I found this. The stains on the back are blood, old blood, from wounds that opened up again while she was riding. Whip marks. I know what whip marks look like. I have carried them myself." The saloon murmured. Judge Hale examined the shirt, held it up to the light, set it down. Then another voice, from the other side of the room, a voice that surprised everyone in the building, including the man it belonged to. "I have something to say, Your Honor. Charlie Morrison stood up. Owen stared at him. Charlie Morrison. The man who had opposed Lydia from the day she arrived, who had called her a drifter and a fraud, who had argued against hiring her and distrusted her methods and questioned her presence at every turn. That Charlie Morrison was standing up in a public hearing to speak on her behalf. Charlie walked to the front of the room, stood straight, shoulders back, the posture of a man who had served and never forgotten how to stand at attention. "I did not like this woman when she showed up," Charlie said. "I told my boss to his face I thought she was trouble. But I have been a soldier, Your Honor. Fought in the war. Seen things I wish I had not. And I know what a person looks like when they have been on the wrong end of cruelty." He paused. His voice was steady, but his hands were not. "I watched her flinch every time a man walked behind her too fast. I watched her sleep in the stable with a knife in her hand because she did not feel safe in a bed with four walls. I watched her check the exits every time she walked into a room the way a soldier does in hostile territory. People who have lived a normal life do not behave that way. People who have been brutalized do." The murmur in the saloon grew louder. Judge Hale raised a hand for quiet. He turned to Robert. "Mr. Graves, this warrant names the victim as Robert Hargrove. You testify that you are a licensed bounty hunter working this case independently. But I am going to ask you a direct question, and I expect a direct answer. What is your relationship to the named victim?" Robert's jaw tightened. The professional mask held for another second, 2, 3, then it cracked. "I am Robert Hargrove," he said. "She is my wife. And everything she just told you is a goddamn lie." The room erupted. Judge Hale banged his fist on the bar. Martinez moved forward. Robert was on his feet now, the composure gone, the real man underneath showing through like bone through broken skin. "She is my wife," Robert said again, louder. "I have the right to discipline my own wife." The words fell into the room like a stone into still water. Silence rippled outward from them. Every person in that saloon heard what Robert Hargrove had just said, and every person understood what it meant. Judge Hale looked at Robert for a very long time. "You just answered every question I was going to ask," the judge said. He ruled. Justifiable self-defense. Warrant vacated. The court found that Lydia Hargrove acted in defense of her own life and was cleared of all charges. Robert Hargrove was to be held at the county jail on charges of forgery of territorial documents, fraud, and assault, pending transfer to the appropriate authorities. Robert exploded. He flipped the table. Papers scattered. He pulled a knife from somewhere on his body. Martinez had confiscated his firearms at the door, but had missed the blade hidden in his boot. He lunged at Lydia. Owen moved, threw himself between them. The knife caught his shoulder, a line of fire across his upper arm. He went down. The saloon doors crashed open. Thunder. The horse had been tied to the post outside, had heard the chaos, had snapped his tether the way a thread snaps. 1,200 pounds of fury came through those swinging doors like a black tornado. Thunder hit Robert with his head. Full force, sent the man flying backward into the bar, then reared up. Front hooves coming down within inches of Robert's skull. Robert covered his head and did not move. Martinez was on him, cuffs on. 2 deputies helping. Robert Hargrove was not getting up. Lydia did not run to Owen, she ran to Thunder. The horse was wild-eyed, shaking, sweat foaming on his neck. The violence of what he had done was still running through him like electricity through a wire. Lydia put her hands on his face, pressed her forehead to his, made that sound. Low and steady and sure. Thunder's breathing slowed. His eyes softened. His shaking eased. Owen lay on the saloon floor with blood running down his arm and watched the woman he loved do the thing she had always done. Choose the one who was panicking over the one who was just in pain. "You picked the horse again," he said. Lydia turned, tears on her face but laughter in her eyes. "You are just in pain. He is panicking. There is a difference." Owen laughed. It hurt his shoulder something fierce, but he laughed anyway. Because some things are funnier when they hurt. The doctor came. stitched Owen's shoulder in the back room of the saloon while Lydia sat beside him holding his uninjured hand. Half the town was watching through the doorway. Neither of them cared. "What is your real name?" Owen said, voice thin but eyes bright. "Lydia Hargrove." "Owen Quillen." "Pleasure to meet you, Lydia Hargrove. For real, this time." She squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. And in the street outside the saloon, Thunder stood quiet and calm with his ears forward and his eyes soft, waiting for his people to come home. There are mornings when the light comes through the gaps in the stable boards and turns the dust to gold, when the air is cool and clean and the mountains stand purple against the sky and the world is so quiet you can hear it breathing, slow and steady, in and out, the way a horse breathes when it finally trusts the hand on its neck. That was the kind of morning it was 3 months after the hearing, when Owen Quillen walked into the stable and found Lydia Hargrove brushing Thunder in the early light and knew exactly what he was going to say. 3 months. That was how long it took to rebuild what the lies had broken. Not the romance. The romance was still there. Had been there since the first morning. Would be there until the last. What needed rebuilding was the trust. And trust, as it turns out, is harder to build the second time because you know how easily it can shatter. There were hard days. Days when Lydia lied out of habit and caught herself and had to back up and try again. Days when Owen caught himself checking on her too often, hovering, controlling, and had to force himself to step back and trust that she stayed because she wanted to, not because she had nowhere else to go. Days when the old patterns reared up like thunder used to, and both of them had to remember what Lydia had taught every horse on that ranch. That trust is earned with patience. And patience is just love that knows how to wait. Robert Hargrove was locked in the county jail, waiting to answer for his crimes. Forgery of territorial documents, fraud, assault with a deadly weapon. The judge had seen to it that the man would not be walking free anytime soon. Lydia's charges were gone. Her name was cleared. She was Lydia Hargrove again. Her real name. The one her father gave her. She wore it now without fear. On a morning in late November, Owen took Lydia to the hill behind the ranch, to the place he had never taken anyone. The wooden cross that marked Eli's grave was weathered but still standing. Owen had carved the name himself, Eli James Quillen, 1862 to 1873, beloved brother. Owen stood there for a long time. Then he told her everything. Not the version Rosa knew, not the version Charlie had heard, the version Owen carried. Every detail, sending Eli out, the rattlesnake, the way Eli said his name once, calm, like he already knew, carrying the boy, running, the porch at sunset, Eli's face going still, his last words. "Do not tell Ma you sent me. Tell her I went on my own." Owen's voice broke on that last part. Not much, just a crack. But it was enough. Lydia did not say the things people always say, did not say it was not your fault, did not try to fix it with words. Words cannot fix a wound that deep. Instead, she stood beside him in the wind and said something he had never considered. "Eli chose to go because he wanted to help you. You did not force him. He volunteered. That is not guilt, Owen. That is love. And you do not get to carry his love like a punishment for the rest of your life. He would not want that." Owen cried. For the first time in 5 years. For the first time since the porch at sunset. Tears running silent down his face while the wind moved through the grass on the hill, and the mountains stood witness. Lydia did not hold him. She stood beside him, close enough to touch but not touching, giving him space to grieve the way he needed to grieve. Because sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone in pain is not try to take the pain away. Sometimes it is just standing there, being present, letting them know they are not alone. They walked back to the ranch in silence. But it was a different silence than the one that had followed the confrontation in her cabin. This silence was clean, like the air after a storm. 3 days later, Owen walked into the stable at dawn. Lydia was there. She was always there at dawn. Thunder was there. He was always there, too. The light was coming through the boards in golden shafts, and the dust was floating in the air like tiny stars. And Lydia was humming that melody. The same one. The one Owen still could not name but would recognize anywhere. He did not have a ring. He had a key. Not the cabin key, not the temporary key, or the permanent key, or any of the keys he had given her before. This was the key to the main house. His house. The house his father built with his own 2 hands. The house where Owen had sat in the dark and stared at a wanted poster and a revolver and tried to figure out which one was more dangerous. He held it out. "This is not because you need a place to stay," he said. "You have proven you can survive anywhere. This is because I need you here. Not to save me, not to fix me, because the life I want to live has you in it. Will you stay? Not because you are scared. Not because you have got nowhere else, because you want to." Lydia looked at the key, looked at Owen. Her green eyes were bright and wet, and she was smiling in a way that made everything else in the world go quiet. "I will not stop lying overnight," she said. 3 years of it turned it into reflex. Some days I will lie about things that do not even matter. Then I will ask you every day, is that the truth? And if it is not, we try again. I do not need perfect Lydia. I need you to try. And I will try too. No controlling, no pushing you away every time I get scared. We try together. Deal. Thunder snorted, loud, shoved his big black head between them like he was tired of waiting for the humans to figure out what he had known since the first morning. Lydia laughed, a real laugh, open and unguarded and free. "I think that is a deal," she said. They were married in December, small ceremony, the church in San Bernardino. Charlie Morrison stood as witness. Rosa wept through the whole thing and denied it afterward. Thunder waited outside the church doors and nickered when Owen and Lydia emerged as husband and wife. 1 year later, August again, early morning. The light doing that thing it does in the stable. Gold and dust and silence. Owen woke to the sound of humming from across the yard. The melody. Her melody. The one she had been humming the first time he found her, with thunder in the dark. He pulled on his boots and walked out to the stable and stood in the doorway. The same doorway. The same shadows. The same angle of light. Lydia was inside, brushing a young colt, Thunder's offspring, black as his father, bright-eyed, curious, already showing signs of the same stubborn spirit that had made Thunder both impossible and irreplaceable. Lydia was bigger now, the curve of her belly visible beneath her dress, 5 months along. The doctor in town said everything looked healthy and strong. Rosa had already started knitting. Lydia turned, saw Owen standing in the doorway, and she smiled. Not the guarded smile of a woman caught somewhere she should not be. Not the careful smile of someone calculating her next lie. The open, undefended smile of a woman who is exactly where she belongs. "You are up before me again," Owen said. "This one is like his father," Lydia said, nodding at the colt. "Needs someone to hear him at 4 in the morning." Owen stepped into the stable, no gun on his hip, no tremble in his hand. He stood beside his wife and rested his palm against her belly where their child was growing, and together they brushed the young horse in the quiet morning light. Thunder watched from the next stall. His ears were forward. His eyes were soft. He was calm, content. The horse that trusted no one had found his people, and he was not letting go. Outside, the sun cleared the San Bernardino range, and the light poured through the stable boards and turned the dust to gold. And Owen Quillen, the man who once believed the world would take everything he loved, stood in that light beside the woman his impossible horse had chosen, and knew that sometimes the world gives back. That is the story of Owen and Lydia Quillen and the horse named Thunder, who trusted no one until the right person came along. It is a story about second chances, about the lies we tell to survive and the truths we tell to live, about a woman who was brave enough to stop running and a man who was brave enough to let someone in. It started on an August morning in 1878 when a cowboy walked into his stable and found a stranger brushing his impossible horse. And he knew right then that she was different. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.